You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
I'm very happy to have joining us again, and I really appreciate the time he spends with us. But Ambassador Francis Rooney, he's got a fantastic book out, The Global Vatican, an inside look at the Catholic Church, world politics, and the extraordinary relationship between the United States and the Holy See. And, of course, he served, and thank you so much for what you've done for our nation, serving as an ambassador at the Vatican, representing us under the Bush administration. Welcome back to the program, Ambassador.
Well, thank you for having me back on.
Well, it's always a pleasure to speak with you, and we love, you always have, very interesting thoughts and insight to not only current events, but some of the experiences that you had. So we do enjoy the conversations that we have with you. But it's our understanding that the President has met with Pope Francis once again, and I'm curious if you can give us some insight as to some of the things that were discussed, but also, unfortunately, the world has seen, an increase in the violence and the threats and the situations abroad in numerous places, not just the Middle East at this point. And was anything discussed as far as that goes, or the potential threat of the new forms of Al-Qaeda that we now refer to as either ISIS or ISIL or IS, whatever we want to call it? But I'm just curious of the types of things that were discussed there.
Well, I think from my understanding of it, the President wanted to focus on the social justice mission and the domestic agenda. So I don't know that the Holy See, was really engaged in foreign policy in that meeting when they had the face-to-face state visit. But I think that Secretary Kerry has spoken with Cardinal Parolin about the Church taking its historic role of speaking up against the persecution of Christians and becoming more vociferous, like Pope Benedict was, in opposing radical Islamicists. And fortunately, some of that seems to be taking root, as we just saw here just lately, where the Pope spoke out about the possible resurrection of the just war theory that used to be used prior to the second Iraq invasion.
Well, it's interesting. And you said it yourself. I mean, I think our biggest concern, and we speak about this all the time, is first of all, the persecution of a lot of people, but in particular, in this case, Christians, Catholics, and people of really all religions that we see going on right now. And I think that, the history of, all the popes have been very outspoken in trying to protect, what is good and what is right and just, and clearly what we witness going on today is the complete opposite. And I think somebody needs to take leadership on these things, and of course we're always looking for the President to take that.
Yeah, if you harken back to what Pope Benedict said about radical Islam and that religion used as an excuse for violence and political hegemony needs to be called out by the world, and Pope Benedict spoke more clearly than anyone. Heretofore, Pope Francis has been fairly muted about that, focused more on his kind of social justice agenda and reforming the church, until just last week when he spoke out pretty clearly. So I'm encouraged that he's going to continue to speak up against the same evils that Pope Benedict spoke up against and Pope John Paul, and lend that soft power voice to the growing effort to oppose organized radical Islamic opposition now.
Yeah, I want to just speak of Pope Francis just on this one particular thing that I've noticed, and it seems to me like he's really made an enormous effort to be close to the people, and I mean all people. I mean he's really tried to involve himself and be around people more so than I think we've seen some of the more other recent popes, and I think it's interesting, and I think it tells us that he's genuine and sincere about some of the things that he's trying to work towards or believes in. And whether we completely agree with him or not, I think it's a good sign that you feel like what somebody is saying and what they're doing are hand in hand.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. In fact, I think one of the great reasons for optimism right now is that he can take the fundamental diplomatic message of the Church, which Pope Benedict spoke about in very deep philosophical verse, and he can say it in a much more understandable, palatable way to reach a broader range of people because of the very personality that you mentioned. If so, he will radically expand the ability of the Holy See to influence world events.
You know, Ambassador, just before you came on the air with us, Brett and I were actually discussing the unique balance that leaders of this country have to, sort of walk this fine line between supporting Judeo-Christian values and what that means to our own republic, as opposed to, or at the same time while separating church and state. And it occurs to me, and I'd love for you to enlighten on this, there's an enormous challenge, I would think, right now that the Pope faces, because he at once needs to be the purveyor of peace and the Catholic faith, and at the same time, how, with everything going on in the world, does he not also need to be more vocal about being a protector? Who are clearly under attack.
And in addition to speaking out, which all popes have done, and now he's started to a little bit, I think the invocation of things like the just war theory are very interesting. Since he came out with that, there was just a big meeting here the other day, including NATO and all the European countries, and trying to he gave them a real window of saying, look, if you have this unjust oppression and murder of innocents, there's application of the just war theory to take them out. But you've got to have an international community, not just a country or two like the United States and Iraq too. And it's got to be proportional. And those are the two things that the Holy See felt did not apply in the second Iraq invasion, and I think they do apply now. And so maybe the Pope's comments have been a catalyst for this recent drawing together of European leaders and NATO, trying to talk about how to get those guys, the European leaders, more interested in funding their part of NATO and getting ready to support efforts to undermine ISIS and this more organized radical Islam than we've ever seen.
It's interesting. Proportionality is, in and of itself, an entire discussion, and maybe if we have time, we could jump into that a bit. But I think there's a really key consideration or point to be made here. If you look at the very fact that this has become, sadly, a religious clash of civilizations, and not by the choice of the West, certainly not by the choice of those who would consider their faith to be Judeo-Christian values, as a foundation. So one of the things that strikes me, and I'd like you to comment on both of these things. One is, do you see any closer alignment between the different major Christian denominations in trying to come up with a more cohesive strategy? Because I don't believe that the Islamists make any discerning difference whether they behead a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, etc. And so that's part of the equation. The second side of it is if you could address the fact that there's a sad, almost sickening alignment between the far left anti-religion progressives and the Islamists, who by their very own nature should be absolute enemies in and of themselves. And if you kind of combine those two dynamics, it's going to take a lot of global coordination for us to actually win this battle, because it's not just about a couple of people being beheaded. It's very, very big.
No, it's very big, and it's very ideologically rooted in the religion that, as Pope Benedict said, he decried against the command of the prophet to spread the word by the sword. We're finally, I think more and more people now are finally starting to get it, what many of us got in 2002, that this is a serious threat and that appeasement's not going to work. And when you talk about the radical left kind of being in an appeasement modality vis-a-vis radical Islam, it makes me think back to the Truman days that I wrote about in the book, when Truman tried to get the Pope and Myron Taylor to unify the Judeo-Christian religions to oppose communism, and it was the Protestant sects, which were kind of pro-socialist, pro-communism, and had no interest in doing it. And that's kind of what you're talking about now with the radical Islamicists and the progressives. And to that point, I haven't really seen enough speaking out to satisfy me from the head of the Anglican Church and the head of the Methodist congregations and all that. And I think once again, you find out that the leading edge of the spear is Israel and the Jewish leaders and the Catholic Church willing to stand up and oppose tyranny and persecution.
That's very interesting. Well, Ambassador Rooney, you've covered so many different things in your book, The Global Vatican, but there are a couple interesting points that you discussed, but I want to get your take on how different you think it is today, or if there's things or some of the issues that you had to deal with almost need to be readdressed right now, but slightly differently. I'll give you an example. Now, we know that, I believe it was 2005 that you had initially started as the ambassador of the Holy See. Yeah, 2005, I'm sorry. So, we were at a time where we were engaged in two conflicts, one in Iraq, one in Afghanistan, and I'm not sure that, there were certainly differences between the Holy See and where we stood on some of these things, and there was some vocal disapproval. But do you see some of the things that were discussed back then and some of the things that you covered in the book? Is there a shift in some of those beliefs now based on what we've experienced in the time since then?
Well, first of all, the Holy See's opposition to the second Iraq invasion was much different than their response to the first Iraq invasion or even Afghanistan. I think now we're more in a mode of where they were with the first Iraq invasion and Afghanistan, where they felt that the situation called for the kind of deployment of forces and opposition which was being considered. In the case of the second Iraq invasion, I think they had this great concern that taking Saddam out was going to increase the persecution of Christians, empower Iraq, and inflame the Sunni Shiite civil war, and therefore it wasn't an appropriate policy response.
I hate to say it, but I think in some of those things, they may have been proven correct.
It's absolutely been proven correct. Now, people can argue that despite all that, it was important to go in and try to see if we couldn't make the first liberal democracy in the Middle East out of Iraq, which also hadn't worked out so well. But regardless of whether we should have gone or not, those three things have in fact happened. And now the situation's become more organized than ever. I mean, instead of these gangs of thugs called Al-Qaeda cells, now we've got this ISIS, which is a profit-making commercial enterprise that's controlling half of Iraq.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And, it's interesting because, to add to what you've just said, you're talking about an organization which now has access to billions of dollars. They've actually been able to take over or confiscate U.S. weapons which were left behind that the Iraqi army had, as they, in the areas where they were either defeated or just cut and ran. And so it is a much greater threat. But I come back to, I do really think that there is an extreme danger for not just Christians, but really most people of other religions within the Middle East and large parts of Africa at this point, and I suppose some parts of Asia as well. And I think, you and John both alluded to it. We need to see a different type of partnership between, some of the usual players such as Israel or Britain and France, and to really take up a leadership and work together to combat this. Because I think if you allow ISIS to continue to grow and to continue to wage their, whatever word we want to use, their genocide upon whoever it is that they go after, if we continue to allow that, it's only going to get worse, and we're only going to have more significant issues to deal with down the road. And, I would say that...
Yeah, what about the threat of radicalizing 100 million Muslims in Indonesia?
Yeah.
That'd be pretty serious. Yeah, they're heretofore. They're still secular.
Well, that's an excellent point. You're talking about 1 billion plus people where now they say, there's a small percentage, but even if they say it's only 10 or 15%, you're talking about 150 million people who could be radicalized. Yeah, well,
like I wrote in the book, back in 2005, Mrs. Bush came and we were sitting there talking to the Pope about Africa, and we got on the subject of the radical madrasas that Saudi Arabia had funded all across secular northern Africa. And they were secular back then. Mali, Nigeria had large Muslim populations but were secular. Now look what you got. Boko Haram, the Al-Qaeda of the Maghreb, so exactly it could spread to Malaysia or Indonesia or anywhere else.
Right, absolutely.
I just want to jump in for a second. Sorry, Brett, but Ambassador, I think you're spot on. The thing that we are seeing right now, and the beheading that just struck, plus the beheading that we had 2 weeks ago, are just immediate but brutally, sort of clarifying for the world to see manifestations of what we really have going on here is two forces coming together. On the one hand, ISIS, which is the ultimate successful commercialization and franchise of evil, and simultaneously we have a socialist progressive driven political vacuum that pretty much says who are we to judge, and that vacuum that's created, even if we assume that all of those progressives are well-intended people, and I don't think that's the case, but even if we make that leap of faith, that vacuum plus that commercialized evil, unbelievably scary. It's actually, I think, a little scarier than communism because at least we knew the communist leaders had no suicidal tendency.
Well, you're right, and as Secretary Rice used to say, when the good state actors leave the stage, bad state actors are more than glad to come in and pick it up. And we're seeing that now. This vacuum of leadership has just created a perception of weakness in the United States, which has allowed Putin and the radical Islamicists to do what they're doing, but it also has allowed Europe to skate. And I think, to go back to your original point, I think there's two things that have to happen. Is we need to be coercing or convincing Europe to step up their defense spending and participate in these global initiatives to combat bad actors bad state actors. But we also need to draw in the Arab and mostly Arab and Turkish countries to help participate in this. I mean, now that we've got ISIS there, the only silver lining is, like I said, we have this non-state entity that even Arab states can rally around opposing. Turkey's got a lot of strategic interest in opposing it, and as do the stands, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, et cetera, which are basically Turkish people. So we got to get those guys on the field with some pads on too.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. There were a couple. You've discussed it's a rather complete book, so you've discussed so many different things. But there was something that I've always loved about our country. Some of the foundational points and beliefs that the United States was founded upon. And you spoke about the connection and similarities of the Holy See and the United States and a lot of these shared beliefs, and particularly, faith and the idea that human persons possess inalienable natural rights which were granted by God. And I think that is so important and so fundamental to why both entities have been so successful for so long and do share a positive relationship. But I'd like you to speak on that.
Well, I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of the United States Holy See relations, that despite times when we didn't agree for one reason or another, or prejudices or monarchical tendencies or whatever, that fundamental root of basing both people's diplomacy and core values around human dignity and the natural rights of man inevitably draw us together. We're the only two organizations or entities in the world that are totally founded on those principles. All the other nations in the country derive from some type of monarchical or autocratic origins, and they've never gotten all that out of their system.
That's very interesting. And, of course, one other thing that, it's more a very interesting fact that you pointed out as well is that despite these shared beliefs or convictions, that the full diplomatic relations with the Vatican were only really established under Ronald Reagan in 1984. And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I think the anti-Catholic prejudice, and I tried to chronicle that without beating a dead horse about it, but it's pretty well known. But I think it kind of peaked with John Kennedy's election. And from the time of John Kennedy's election to Reagan, there were several very important personal representatives. Nixon sent Henry Cabot Lodge after he came back from Vietnam. And, so I think that culminated with the political climate, which was acceptable for elevating the nature of the mission to a full ambassador. But the seeds were laid much earlier. Really, the seeds were laid in World War II with the great value that we derived from Myron Taylor.
Do you think that there was any fallout from the Kennedy presidency that had any impact on the relationship? Or
no, I think it was all quite positive. There was an implicit fallout that President Kennedy ran away from anything to do with the Church and the Holy See as fast as he could because of all the problems that he encountered trying to get elected. But he did send Mrs. Kennedy to Rome and all that kind of stuff. So if there was a fallout, one of I guess you could say it's an implicit fallout, was kind of a chilling of the relationship publicly at least under President Kennedy because of the electoral politics.
So the last question, Ambassador Francis Rooney, of course, his book is The Global Vatican. I definitely recommend that you pick up a copy. It's fascinating. But if you were able to sit down at a table right now with Pope Francis and with President Barack Obama, and you could have a discussion and bring up one or two particular points, what would those be right now?
Well, I would definitely encourage both parties to focus on these fundamental principles that draw us together, and to urge President Obama to leverage the Holy See's soft power voice in the areas where there are problems, whether it's Latin America, parts of Africa, Central African Republic, for example, or certainly this business with ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And likewise, I would say to the Pope that you need to take a page out of Pope Benedict's book, which he's recently started to do, and start speaking up about these things, because you are the world's soft power leader in areas of human dignity and religious and other kinds of persecutions.
Excellent, and thank you so much. Ambassador, do you have a Twitter handle?
No, I don't. I don't know how to do that. But I do have a website, francisrooney.com.
Excellent. francisrooney.com? Okay, we'll make sure that we post that up. And, of course, folks, please pick up a copy of his book, The Global Vatican, an inside look at the Catholic Church, world politics, and extraordinary relationship between the United States and the Holy See. Ambassador, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much, and we look forward to having you back soon.
Well, thank you very much for having me back on and for all you're doing to get the good word out.
Absolutely. Well, good luck. God bless.